Freedom of thought is our heritage as Unitarians and has been bought over many centuries on a kind of an installment plan and at great cost to those who bequeathed it to us. I ask us today to acknowledge our debt to them. Herewith is a list of just a handful of people that we owe. Michael Servetus, who was the first Reformation theologian to take the radical position in 1532 that the concept of the Trinity was both unscriptural and irrational, that infant baptism was an unnecessary indoctrination of the faithful. For these entirely reasonable objections to both the Catholic Church and Reformation Christianity, he was burned in effigy, and then in person. This was a thinker who postulated, by the way, the circulation of blood 75 years before William Harvey is credited with discovering it. And as the wood was lit that would roast him, this strong, free, independent mind called on Jesus, Son of the eternal God. An expression, had he but reversed the position of one word, Jesus, eternal Son of God, would have been enough to save his life. Sebastian Castellio, a scholar who in 1612 published an eloquent plea for a toleration of heresy, for fresh, reasoned principles in the interpretation of Scripture. Both of these are fundamental to any grasp of modern Unitarianism. For these views, he suffered personal disgrace, penury, and contempt, which for us would spell failure and breakdown. His freedoms were forfeited, but we inherit his legacy. John Biddle, called the father of English Unitarianism, who fearlessly asserted that faith should never be contrary to reason or above reason, that no authority should be ascribed to the early Christian church or its founders. These assertions earned him repeated imprisonment under Cromwell. Though he narrowly escaped the death penalty, he died of a disease contracted while in prison, and we too inherit his legacy. And finally, this list, in no particular order and in no particular rank of importance, is the Reverend James Reeb, a white Unitarian minister who was killed by racist thugs in Selma, Alabama, while he was marching for civil rights. Dr. King said of Reverend James Reeb, James Reeb was murdered by the indifference of every minister who has remained silent behind the safe security of stained glass windows. He was murdered by the irrelevance of a church that will stand amid social evil and serve as a tail light rather than a headlight, an echo rather than a voice. In showing us an example of a committed Unitarian faith, we are likewise the inheritors of the life and the brutal death of Reverend Reeb. These are just a selection, and I could go on, but the point is this. Here we sit, right now, the heirs of the freedoms these brave souls championed. Freedom from orthodoxy, freedom from tradition, freedom from delusion, freedom from mysticism, free from political tyranny which tells us what and how to believe, free from any authority save our own conscience. In the words of political historian Gerald Johnson, we are reluctant to admit that we owe our liberties to men of a type that today we hate and fear. Unruly men, disturbers of the peace, in a word, free men. As someone recently said, freedom isn't free. So it behooves us, I think, to carry on this tradition, rightly rejoicing in their gift to us by passing it on. If we have any conscience at all, we are, in some sense, beholden to the givers, not merely because it's our tradition and our heritage, and that would hardly be free thinking, would it? But because we know freedom is in the interests of ourselves as human beings, and, not to be grandiose, but because we also know that freedom of thought is the only way forward in the evolution of our species to a more enlightened world, where reason and loving kindness prevail. Or we can stay where we are, in a world where literal interpretation of ancient literature is used as a pretext for genocide. and where meek faiths remain safe and silent behind stained glass windows. But surely, history has had an end, as Francis Fukuyama has argued. We have a free market economy, free democratic elections, a social system based thereon which allows a significant degree of free mobility. We are no longer bound by traditions that govern what we must think or must do with our lives. Right? Indeed, here we sit now, 40 years since the death of Dr. King, with an African American as leader of the free world, in a free country ourselves, though just how free we are when an aristocrat in a top hat can dissolve Parliament is debatable. In a free, non-creedal church composed of free thinkers, in a free society where every one of us assembled here is free from the kind of state oppression that throws people like us into jail or worse. In a free economy, free from the kind of want that the vast majority of the world experiences, living on less than $1 a day. If you're starving, you're not free. Free to worship in our own way, to miss a week or two of church, or even more, without incurring the censure of the priest, or the vicar, or the minister. So who, since time began, is as free as we are here? Who over the reaches of the rolling globe is as free as a Unitarian in Australia, where one of our central principles is the free and responsible search for truth and meaning? So is this, here and now, how it would feel to be free? Have we truly realized this dream of mankind? Well, we're not unruly people. We're not disturbers of the peace. Or are we? Perhaps we should step out of line once in a while. Perhaps social and political and economic change is none of our business, or just too hard, or as Fukuyama suggests, just unnecessary because we've arrived at the best of all possible worlds. Or maybe we're just complacent about such issues, complacent with the freedoms we inherit. If so, fair enough. And I don't want to be the sort of preacher whose theme is that we all live in bad faith. Maybe such large-scale objectives are too hard, are beyond our modest capabilities. But leaving aside the large political social picture, there is still a manageable arena to do the work of freedom within. Because we betray the gift of freedom of thought if we do not work to unshackle ourselves from inner constraints to our thinking, which are far more elusive, far more insidious, and far more personally confronting. The truth that truly makes us free is usually the truth one truly prefers not to hear. What are some of these inner constraints, these chains to freedom? The psychologist Erich Fromm, in his book Fear of Freedom, eloquently describes fear of freedom as the chief illness of our time, one that expresses itself as an abject submission to authority. It's a good old friend, this book, 7 shillings and 6pence. You can tell it's a little bit old. The rise of democracy and capitalism, while setting men free, has also created a society in which we feel isolated from our fellows, where relationships are more impersonal, where insecurity replaces a sense of belonging, where community dies. It is this sense of isolation that drives us to submission to all-powerful organizations, religions, or state power. Hence the rise of fascism in the past century. Hence the seemingly unstoppable swell of fundamentalist Christianity or Islam. Hence the excesses of socialism in the former Soviet Union. Hence the rise of China and its seeming contempt for individual human rights. In the face of such mighty forces, we might well feel paralyzed to act, but how free is paralysis?